Hello, my name is Maria Schmitz, and today we are here to talk about nation language as Edward Brathwaite conceived it. No, it's not about dialect, that'll come later. Jamaica's cuisine is tightly interwoven with its history, with roots in both the indigenous population and those who came here. I think this is a good analogy to start with. Speaking of The Harder They Come in 1972, the Jamaican film, Brathwaite said, "For the first time, at last, a local face, a native icon, a nation language voice was the hero. In this small corner of our world, a revolution as significant as emancipation." This is how critical the importance is that Brathwaite places onto the concept and usage of nation language. Like the variety of dishes I mentioned at the beginning, Brathwaite says, "We in the Caribbean have a similar kind of plurality. We have English, which is the imposed language on much of the archipelago. English is an imperial language, as are French, Dutch, and Spanish. We have what we call Creole English, which is a mixture of English and an adaptation that English took in the new environment of the Caribbean when it became mixed with the other imported languages. We also have what is called nation language, which is the kind of English spoken by the people who were brought to the Caribbean, not the official English now, but the language of slaves and laborers, the servants, who were brought in by the conquistadors. Finally, we have the remnants of ancestral languages still persisting in the Caribbean, what he calls elsewhere cultural schizophrenia, that stems from learning a language and culture that is not supported by the daily realities of the environment in which one lives. There is Amerindian, which is active in certain parts of Central America but not in the Caribbean because the Amerindians are a destroyed people and their languages were practically destroyed. We have Hindi, spoken by some of the more traditional East Indians who live in the Caribbean, and there are also varieties of Chinese. And miraculously, there are survivals of African languages still persisting in the Caribbean. So we have that spectrum of languages. So, because the conquistadores, as he calls them, didn't want to hear people speaking Ashanti and these other kinds of languages, he said there was a submergence of this imported language. Its status became one of inferiority. Similarly, its speakers were slaves. They were conceived of as inferiors, non human, in fact. But this very submergence served as an interesting intercultural purpose because although people continued to speak English as it was spoken in Elizabethan times and on through the Romantic and Victorian ages, that English was nonetheless still being influenced by the underground language, the submerged language that the slaves had brought. And that underground language was itself constantly transforming itself into new forms. It was moving from a purely African form to a form that was African, but which was adapting to the new environment and to the cultural imperatives of the European languages. And it was influencing the way in which French, Dutch, and Spanish was spoken. So there was a very complex process taking place, which is now beginning to surface in Caribbean literature. His talk is about using language in a different way. He says, "We haven't got the syllables, the syllabic intelligence to describe the hurricane, which is our own experience, whereas we can describe the imported alien experience of the snowfall." It is that kind of situation that the Caribbean is in. He gives an example of a child who, instead of writing "the snow was falling on the fields of Shropshire," wrote "the snow was falling on the cane fields." The child was trying to have both cultures at the same time, but this, he says, is creolization. What is even more important as we develop this business of emergent language in the Caribbean is the actual rhythm and syllables, the very bodywork, in a way, of the language, what English has given us as a model for poetry and to a lesser extent prose. But poetry's basic tool here, he says, is the pentameter. How do you get a rhythm that approximates the natural experience, the environmental experience? The Caribbean has been trying to break out of the entire pentametric model, Brathwaite says, and to move into a system that more closely and intimately approaches our own experience. It is nation language in the Caribbean that, in fact, largely ignores the pentameter. Nation language is the language that is influenced very strongly by the African model, the African aspect of our New World Caribbean heritage. English it may be in terms of its lexicon, but it is not English in terms of its syntax. And English it certainly is not in terms of its rhythm and timbre, its own sound explosion. In its contours, it is not English, even though the words as you hear them would be English to a greater or lesser degree. It is an English that is not the standard imported, educated English, but that of the submerged, surrealist experience and sensibility, which has always been there and which is now increasingly coming to the surface and influencing the perception of contemporary Caribbean people. It is what he calls nation language. He uses the term in contrast to dialect, which he says is the language when you want to make fun of someone. Caricature speaks in dialect. Dialect has a long history coming from the plantation where people's dignity was distorted through their languages and the descriptions that the dialect gave to them. Nation language, on the other hand, is the submerged area of that dialect that is much more closely allied to the African aspect of experience in the Caribbean. It may be in English, but often it is in an English which is like a howl or a shout, or a machine gun, or the wind, or the wave. It is also like the blues. And sometimes it is English and African at the same time. And he also notes that many Caribbean writers have not yet ventured to use nation language, as the critics have lagged far behind. Part of the definition is total expression. And he quotes the tradition. The oral tradition makes demands not only on the poet but also on the audience to complete the community. The noise and sounds that the poet makes are responded to by the audience and are returned to him. Hence, we have the creation of a continuum where the meaning truly resides. And this total expression comes about because people live in the open air, because people live in conditions of poverty, because people come from a historical experience where they had to rely on their own breath patterns rather than on paraphernalia like books and museums. They had to depend on immanence, the power within themselves, rather than the technology outside themselves. Brathwaite cites Mackay as an example of a poet who wrote in standard English. And Mackay, by the way, is Jamaican born, but he practiced in the States in what has come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. In order to be universal, Mackay forsook his nation language, forsook his early mode of poetry, and went to the sonnet. And according to Brathwaite, the only thing that retains Mackay's uniqueness is the tone of the poet's voice, which brings us back to timbre. Another thing Mackay did was sometimes slip into de rather than saying the, which is a form of nation language, according to Brathwaite. And these elisions, the sound of them, subtly erode somewhat the classical pentametric of Mackay's sonnet. Edouard Glissant, a novelist from Martinique, once described nation language like this. For him, nation language is a strategy of the enslaved person. The slave is forced to use a certain kind of language in order to disguise themselves, to disguise their personality, and to retain their culture. And Glissant defines that language as forced poetics, because it is a kind of prison language, he says, if you want to call it that. Brathwaite has added that the poetry, the culture itself, exists not in a dictionary but in the tradition of the spoken word. It is based as much on sound as it is on song. That is to say, the noise that it makes is part of the meaning, and if you ignore the noise, or what you would think of as noise, shall I say, then you lose part of the meaning, he wrote. When it is written, you lose the sound of, or the noise, and therefore you lose part of the meaning. He then also touches on religious ritual forms like kumina that belong to nation language or part of nation language and which disclose the complexity that is possible with nation language.